Thunder froze mid-stride at the starting line, his battle-scarred body trembling as 300 spectators erupted in cruel laughter. The 8-year-old German Shepherd's amber eyes darted frantically across the crowd, searching for an escape that didn't exist. This wasn't supposed to be a charity case competing against elite police canines. A woman in the bleachers pointed at Thunder's pronounced limp and shouted, "$20 says he doesn't make it past the first obstacle." Her voice carried across the arena like a whip crack. Children giggled. Adults pulled out their phones to record what they assumed would be a spectacular failure. Ethan Cole's weathered hands shook as he knelt beside his partner, remembering the day 6 weeks ago when Colonel Sam Harrison had thrown this broken dog at him like garbage. His mother's wedding ring pressed against his palm, her final gift before the cancer took her last month. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered, but his own voice betrayed his terror. What had possessed him to believe a discarded military dog could compete against champions? And why did Thunder's eyes hold such haunting intelligence, as if he knew secrets that could destroy them all? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Cedar Falls, Wyoming had always been a town where your last name determined your future. Population 8,400, nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business before breakfast was served. The economic divide ran as deep as the mountain streams. Ranch owners and military contractors on one side, working families scrambling to make ends meet on the other. 6 weeks earlier, Ethan Cole had been just another young man with impossible dreams and empty pockets. At 22, he possessed the weathered hands of someone who'd worked since childhood and the determined eyes of his late father, Sergeant Michael Cole, who died in Iraq when Ethan was 7. The boy had grown up in his mother Helen's hair salon, Helen's Hair Haven, where she charged $8 an hour and worked 60-hour weeks just to keep their small apartment above the shop. Helen Cole was the kind of woman Cedar Falls bred, tough as winter wind, gentle as spring rain, and fierce as a mama bear protecting her cub. Widowed at 37, she'd raised Ethan with a combination of military discipline and unconditional love, working her fingers raw to ensure he never felt the absence of his father's income. She kept Michael's Purple Heart on the kitchen table, a daily reminder that some sacrifices echo through generations. "Dogs see what people hide," Helen always told her son, watching him gentle, nervous pets, while their owners gossiped under hair dryers. Ethan had inherited his father's way with animals, a supernatural ability to calm the wildest creatures with nothing but patience and understanding. Neighbors brought him their problem dogs, and somehow, miraculously, he always found solutions. On the wealthy side of town stood the Harrison K9 Training Academy, a sprawling facility that looked more like a military installation than a dog training center. Colonel Sam Harrison had built his empire on 30 years of military service and 3 years of profound grief. At 58, he commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His silver hair always perfectly groomed, his shoulders still military straight, despite the bourbon that had become his closest companion since Afghanistan took his only son. The academy trained police dogs, military working dogs, and personal protection animals for the wealthy. It was a $3 million operation that employed half the town and reminded everyone daily of the social order. Sam Harrison lived in a mansion overlooking Cedar Falls, surrounded by memories of Lieutenant Danny Harrison, whose bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it 3 years ago. Dress uniform pressed, medals displayed, bed made with military precision. But it was the kennel behind the main building that held the Academy's darkest secret. Kennel 19 housed a German Shepherd named Thunder, 8 years old, 15 pounds underweight, with amber eyes that held enough pain to break anyone who looked too long. He'd been Danny's partner for 4 years in Afghanistan, decorated for saving 23 lives before everything went wrong on that final mission. Thunder hadn't worked in 3 years. He barely ate. He certainly didn't trust humans anymore. Until Ethan Cole walked into his life and changed everything. Monday morning arrived in Cedar Falls with the kind of crisp September air that promised winter wasn't far behind. Ethan Cole sat in his rusted pickup truck outside the Harrison K-9 Academy at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before the facility opened. His hands trembled as he practiced his speech in the rear-view mirror, the words he'd rehearsed 100 times suddenly feeling clumsy on his tongue. "Sir, I'd like to apply for the apprentice program," he whispered to his reflection. "I know I don't have formal training, but I've been working with dogs my whole life." The portfolio on his passenger seat contained handwritten training logs, before and after photos of neighbor dogs he'd rehabilitated, and even crude videos shot on his mother's old phone showing his natural ability to communicate with animals that others had given up on. Helen had pressed her last $20 into his palm that morning, along with a thermos of coffee and her blessing. "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, honey," she'd said, quoting the Wayne Gretzky poster that hung in their cramped kitchen. "Your daddy would be so proud." At 8 sharp, a black Mercedes pulled through the academy gates. Colonel Sam Harrison stepped out, his silver hair immaculate despite the early hour, his bearing still military straight. But Ethan's keen eye caught the slight tremor in the older man's hands, the faint smell of bourbon that clung to his perfectly pressed uniform shirt. Sam Harrison might fool the rest of Cedar Falls, but he couldn't hide the signs of a man drowning in grief from someone who understood loss. Ethan climbed out of his truck, portfolio clutched against his chest like armor. "Sir, I'd like to apply for the apprentice program." Sam barely glanced up from his keys. "Son, this isn't charity work. We train professional working dogs here, not pets." "I understand that, sir. But I believe I have something to offer." Ethan opened his portfolio with steady hands, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "I've been working with problem dogs since I was 12. Dogs other people said were hopeless." Sam's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You think watching YouTube videos makes you a dog trainer? College boy, this is a $3 million operation. We provide canines to law enforcement agencies across 5 states. You think I'm going to trust that to some kid who learned his trade in a beauty salon?" Other handlers and staff members began arriving, drawn by the raised voices. Cell phones appeared, recording what was quickly becoming a public spectacle. Ethan felt heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his voice steady. "Sir, I just want a chance to prove myself." "Prove yourself?" Sam's voice carried across the parking lot, attracting more onlookers. "You want to prove yourself? Fine." His bloodshot eyes glittered with cruel inspiration. "You want a dog? I'll give you a dog." The crowd followed as Sam stalked toward the back of the facility, past the gleaming training rings and state-of-the-art kennel buildings, to a cluster of isolation units that most visitors never saw. The smell hit Ethan first, the sour scent of an animal that had given up hope. Then he saw the cage, and his heart broke. The German Shepherd cowered in the far corner of Kennel 19, his once magnificent coat matted and dull, ribs visible beneath patchy fur. One rear leg was held at an odd angle, and his amber eyes held a pain so deep it seemed to echo off the concrete walls. This wasn't just a sick dog. This was a soul in torment. "This was my son's dog," Sam said, his voice suddenly thick with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "Now he's just taking up space, waiting to die. You train him for the regional K-9 competition in 6 weeks, or get out of my sight forever." The other handlers exchanged glances. "Colonel, that's suicide," one of them muttered. "That dog hasn't worked in 3 years. That's not a training challenge," another added. "That's a death sentence." But Ethan barely heard them. He approached the kennel slowly, his hands visible, his voice soft. "Hey there, beautiful boy. "What's your name?" "Thunder," Sam spat. "And he's about as useful as his name suggests. All noise, no substance." For an hour, Ethan sat cross-legged outside the cage, just talking. He told Thunder about his father, about growing up without a dad, about his mother's strength, and his own dreams. He talked about the dogs he'd saved, the trust he'd earned, the healing he'd witnessed when patients met pain. And slowly, impossibly, one of Thunder's ears twitched forward. "Deal," Ethan said finally, standing to face Sam Harrison. "But when we win that competition, you give me a real job." Sam's bitter laughter echoed off the kennel walls. "When you win, son, that dog will be lucky to survive the week." The first 5 days after the deal were the longest of Ethan's life. Thunder wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond to commands, and spent most of his time pressed against the back wall of his kennel as if trying to disappear into the concrete. Every morning, Ethan arrived at dawn with fresh food, clean water, and gentle words that seemed to evaporate into the Wyoming air without effect. But Ethan had learned patience from his mother, who'd waited 15 years for customers to trust her enough to share their deepest secrets while she cut their hair. He understood that healing couldn't be rushed, that trust was earned in moments so small they were almost invisible. On the third evening, as autumn shadows lengthened across the kennel yard, Helen arrived with a thermos of soup and a worn library book tucked under her arm. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, settling beside her son on the ground outside Thunder's cage. But Ethan noticed how her eyes lingered on the dog, studying him with the intensity she usually reserved for particularly challenging haircuts. "Mama, what's that book?" he asked, recognizing the focused expression that meant she was working on something important. Helen held up a thick volume titled Military Working Dogs, Heroes of Modern Warfare. "Been doing some reading at the library. Your Thunder here isn't just any dog, honey. He's got quite a story." The pages she showed him were filled with photographs of German shepherds in combat gear, stories of canine heroes who'd saved countless lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it was the newspaper clippings she'd photocopied that made Ethan's blood run cold. The headline read, "Local War Hero Dog Awarded Congressional Medal for Canine Bravery." The photograph showed a younger, healthier Thunder standing beside a soldier in dress uniform. The caption identified them as Thunder and Lieutenant Danny Harrison, recently decorated for saving 23 lives during their 4-year deployment in Afghanistan. "Danny Harrison," Ethan whispered. "Colonel Harrison's son." "The one who died 3 years ago," Helen confirmed quietly. "Now you understand why that dog's been locked up like a prisoner. Sam Harrison doesn't see Thunder as a war hero. He sees him as a living reminder of what he lost." That night, Ethan didn't go home. He brought his sleeping bag to the kennel and spent the night talking to Thunder through the chain-link fence. He told him about the article, about Danny's sacrifice, about the 23 people who were alive because Thunder had done his job perfectly for 4 years. "You're not broken," Ethan said into the darkness. "You're grieving. There's a difference." Thunder's ear twitched forward, just slightly, but enough to give Ethan hope. The breakthrough came on the 5th day, when Grace Harrison appeared at the kennel like an answer to a prayer Ethan hadn't known he was offering. She was 26, with her father's military bearing softened by gentle eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. In her hands was a veterinary bag and an expression of barely controlled rage. "You must be Ethan Cole," she said, extending a firm handshake. "I'm Grace Harrison, and I owe you an explanation." She knelt beside Thunder's kennel with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years caring for animals. "I've been taking care of him in secret for 3 years," she admitted, her voice tight with guilt. "Bringing him medicine for his arthritis, good food when my father wasn't watching, trying to keep him alive when everyone expected him to just fade away." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Ethan asked, watching as Thunder actually approached the front of his kennel for the first time since they'd met. Grace's laugh was bitter. "Because my father blames Thunder for Danny's death. In his mind, a good dog would have saved his handler. He can't accept that sometimes even heroes can't prevent tragedy." She opened her veterinary bag and began examining Thunder through the fence. The dog allowed it, even seemed to take comfort from her familiar touch. "Thunder doesn't have physical problems," she continued. "His limp is psychosomatic. His refusal to eat is depression. What you're looking at is canine PTSD, and it's every bit as real as what my father suffers from." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. "You mean all this time, he's been suffering from the same thing as Colonel Harrison? Two broken souls, each blaming themselves for surviving when Danny didn't," Grace confirmed. "My father drinks himself to sleep every night, and Thunder hasn't had a peaceful day since we brought him home from the war." That evening, Grace returned with proper dog food, supplements for Thunder's joints, and something even more valuable, Danny's military records. She spread them across the hood of Ethan's pickup truck as the sun set behind the mountains. "Danny's final radio transmission," she said, pointing to a transcript that made Ethan's throat tighten. "He was calling in his own position when the IED went off. Thunder was 30 yards away, following orders to secure the perimeter. There was nothing he could have done." But it was the letter tucked inside the file that broke Ethan's heart completely. Written in a young soldier's careful handwriting, it was addressed to Thunder himself. "To my best friend and partner, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it home like we planned. But I need you to know that you were the best partner a soldier could ask for. You saved 23 people during our time together, including me more times than I can count. You never failed me, boy. Not once. I hope whoever takes care of you knows what a hero they're getting." When Ethan finished reading, he looked up to find Thunder standing at the front of his kennel, amber eyes fixed on the letter as if he could somehow sense his old partner's words. He's been waiting, Ethan realized. All this time he's been waiting for someone to tell him it wasn't his fault. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Thunder finished his entire bowl of food. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Trust, Ethan learned, was like physical therapy, painful, slow, and requiring more patience than most people possessed. But by the end of the first week, Thunder was eating regularly and had stopped cowering when humans approached his kennel. By the second week, he allowed Ethan to clip a leash to his collar and walk him around the academy grounds after hours, when Colonel Harrison was safely locked away in his office with a bottle of bourbon. The walks revealed the extent of Thunder's psychological wounds. Every sudden noise, a car door slamming, a dog barking in the distance, sent him into a trembling crouch, his amber eyes scanning for threats that existed only in his traumatized mind. But Ethan had patience. And more importantly, he had Helen's wisdom guiding him. "That dog's carrying invisible scars," Helen observed one evening as she watched Ethan coax Thunder through a simple sit-stay exercise. "Just like plenty of folks in this town who came back from overseas, the wounds you can't see are often the deepest ones." Helen had her own secrets, though she hadn't shared them yet. During her late-night shifts at the salon, when the town's insomniacs and night shift workers stopped by for cuts, she'd been quietly gathering information about Thunder's military service. What she discovered made her both proud and heartbroken. Thunder had been deployed to Afghanistan at 18 months old, paired with Danny Harrison straight out of K-9 training school. For 4 years, they'd been inseparable. Danny often said Thunder could read his mind before he even gave a command. Their unit specialized in explosive detection, clearing roads and buildings so infantry could move safely through hostile territory. The commendations in Thunder's file read like a war hero's resume. Detection of 17 improvised explosive devices, location of 3 missing soldiers, protection of his handler during 4 separate firefights. But it was the witness statements that revealed the true bond between dog and soldier. Sergeant Maria Santos had written, "Danny talked to that dog like he was a person, and Thunder listened like he understood every word." By the third week, Thunder's physical condition was improving dramatically. Grace had been providing supplements that helped with his joint pain, and the daily exercise was rebuilding muscle mass he'd lost during 3 years of kenneled depression. More importantly, his spirit was slowly returning. He began to wag his tail, tentatively at first, then with genuine enthusiasm when Ethan arrived each morning. But it was the neighbors who truly accelerated Thunder's healing. Betty Thompson, an 89-year-old widow who lived across from the academy, had watched Ethan's patient work from her kitchen window. One morning, she appeared at the kennel fence with a ham bone and a story that changed everything. "My late husband fought in Korea," she said, scratching Thunder's ears through the chain link. "Came back different than when he left. Took him years to sleep through the night without nightmares. But you know what helped him? Having a purpose again. Feeling needed." She looked pointedly at Ethan. "This dog doesn't need pity, son. He needs a job." That afternoon, Ethan began introducing basic training exercises. Nothing complicated, simple recalls, heel work, basic obedience. Thunder's response was startling. Commands he'd forgotten, he knew, came flooding back, muscle memory overriding 3 years of disuse. Within hours, he was performing complex maneuvers with precision that left Ethan breathless. "Good boy, Thunder," Ethan praised after a particularly impressive sequence. "Danny would be so proud of you." At the mention of his old partner's name, Thunder's entire demeanor changed. His ears perked forward, his tail lifted, and for the first time since Ethan had met him, the dog looked truly alive. It was Grace who explained the phenomenon when she stopped by that evening. "Danny used to end every training session the same way," she said, tears in her eyes. "He'd tell Thunder that he was proud of him, that he was a good boy. I think Thunder's been waiting 3 years to hear those words again." Word of Thunder's remarkable recovery began spreading through Cedar Falls, but not everyone was pleased with the progress. Colonel Harrison had been watching from his office window, and what he saw filled him with a rage that went beyond rational thought. Every successful exercise, every moment of joy in Thunder's rehabilitation felt like a betrayal of Danny's memory. The confrontation came during the 4th week, on a crisp October morning when autumn leaves crunched under Thunder's paws as he practiced agility work. Ethan had set up a simple obstacle course in the academy's parking lot, and Thunder was navigating it with increasing confidence. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered: Grace, Helen, Betty Thompson, and several other townspeople who'd heard about the miracle dog. Colonel Harrison burst through the academy's front doors like a man possessed, his face flushed with alcohol and fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing with my property?" The confrontation was ugly and public. Harrison accused Ethan of exploiting a war veteran's memory for attention, of using my dead son's dog to make yourself feel important. The words cut deep because they carried just enough truth to sting. Ethan was nobody special, just a poor kid with big dreams and no credentials. But it was Thunder's reaction that shocked everyone present. Instead of cowering as he had for 3 years whenever Harrison appeared, the dog moved protectively in front of Ethan. His stance was alert but not aggressive, the posture of a trained protection dog assessing a potential threat to his handler. "You see?" Harrison snarled, pointing at Thunder. "He turned my son's dog against me. Danny's dog won't even obey me anymore." Grace stepped forward, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "Dad, Thunder was never yours. He was Danny's partner, and Danny asked us to take care of him. You've spent 3 years trying to kill him with neglect, and now you're angry because someone showed him kindness?" The public humiliation might have ended things differently for a proud man like Sam Harrison, but the truth in his daughter's words cut too deep to ignore. That night, alone in his study with Danny's photographs watching from the walls, he made a decision that would change everything. The sabotage began subtly. Equipment malfunctions during training sessions. Permits for the local park mysteriously revoked. Whispered conversations that painted Ethan as delusional. A young man so desperate for attention, he'd convinced himself he could train an untrainable dog. The pressure worked. Within days, Ethan lost his part-time job at the mechanic shop, and Helen found herself mysteriously losing customers at the salon. But the community of Cedar Falls was more complex than Harrison had anticipated. For every person who believed his whispered campaign, another rallied to support the underdog story unfolding in their midst. Mrs. Thompson organized a fundraising drive for Thunder's competition entry fee. The local veterinarian, Dr. James Mitchell, began providing free medical care. Even some of Harrison's own employees started showing up after hours to watch Ethan work, quietly impressed by what they were witnessing. The breaking point came during the 5th week when Ethan attempted to introduce protection work, the most advanced and dangerous aspect of canine training. Thunder had excelled at every other discipline, but protection work required confronting the very trauma that had broken him in the first place. The exercise began simply enough, a padded volunteer acting as a suspect while Thunder learned to bark on command and hold a protective position. But when the volunteer raised his arm in a threatening gesture, Thunder's PTSD triggered with devastating force. The dog's eyes went blank. His body locked into a rigid crouch, and he began emitting a low, continuous whine that sounded like nothing so much as pure anguish. Ethan immediately called off the exercise, but the damage was done. Thunder spent the rest of the day pressed against the back wall of his kennel, refusing food, refusing comfort, lost in memories that only he could see. For the first time since they'd begun working together, Ethan wondered if some wounds were simply too deep to heal. Grace found him that evening, sitting outside Thunder's kennel with tears in his eyes. "Maybe your father's right," Ethan said quietly. "Maybe I'm just some kid playing with forces I don't understand. Maybe Thunder isn't ready for this kind of work." But Grace had spent 3 years watching her father destroy himself with similar self-doubt. "Do you know what Danny's last letter to me said?" she asked, settling beside Ethan on the cold ground. "He said Thunder wasn't just the best military dog he'd ever seen, he was the best friend he'd ever had. And that if anything happened to him, Thunder would need someone who understood that their partnership was about love, not just training." She pulled out her phone and showed Ethan a video that made his breath catch. It was Danny and Thunder during a training exercise, the young soldier's face bright with pride as his partner executed a perfect protection sequence. But it was the aftermath that mattered most. Danny dropping to his knees, Thunder rushing into his arms, the absolute joy and trust between them visible even through a phone screen. "That's what Thunder's missing," Grace said softly. "Not the training, not the commands, the celebration, the love. Danny never made Thunder work for approval. He gave it freely, every single day." The next morning, Ethan tried a different approach. Instead of formal protection training, he simply played with Thunder, tug of war with an old rope, fetch with a tennis ball, the kind of carefree interaction the dog hadn't experienced in 3 years. And slowly, cautiously, Thunder began to remember what joy felt like. By the end of the week, they were ready to attempt protection work again. But this time, when Thunder successfully held his position and barked on command, Ethan didn't just praise him. He celebrated him, dropping to his knees and letting the dog know he was the best, bravest, most wonderful partner anyone could ask for. Thunder's tail wagged so hard his whole body wiggled, and for the first time since Danny's death, he looked like a dog who believed in himself again. Competition day arrived with the kind of crystalline October morning that made the Rocky Mountains look close enough to touch. Ethan woke before dawn in his sleeping bag beside Thunder's kennel, a ritual they'd maintained for the past 2 weeks. The dog was already alert, ears pricked forward as if he understood the significance of this day. After 6 weeks of intensive training, Thunder had transformed from a broken shell into something approaching his former glory, though the shadow of trauma still lingered in his amber eyes. The regional K9 competition drew participants from across 5 states, turning Cedar Falls into a bustling hub of activity. Professional handlers arrived in custom trailers with dogs worth more than most people's cars, their equipment gleaming with corporate sponsorships and decades of breeding excellence. The contrast was stark when Ethan loaded Thunder into the back of his rusted pickup truck, the dog's only gear consisting of a borrowed collar and a leash Helen had purchased from the local hardware store. By 8 in the morning, over 300 spectators had gathered at the Cedar Falls Community Center, where the competition grounds had been set up with military precision. 4 distinct testing areas sprawled across 2 acres, an agility course that looked like an obstacle race designed by someone with a sadistic imagination, a scent detection field scattered with dozens of identical boxes, an obedience ring where the slightest deviation from perfect heel position could mean disqualification, and finally, the protection demonstration area that made Ethan's stomach clench with nervous anticipation. The other competitors regarded Ethan and Thunder with expressions ranging from bemused curiosity to outright disdain. Marcus Steele, a professional handler from Denver whose German Shepherd had won 3 consecutive regional championships, didn't bother hiding his contempt. "Son, you sure you're in the right competition?" he drawled, looking at Thunder's slightly graying muzzle and careful gait. "This isn't a retirement home showcase." Thunder's response was subtle but unmistakable. The dog drew himself to his full height, ears forward, tail held high with quiet dignity. For just a moment, the war hero Danny had loved shone through the trauma. And even Steele's championship dog took a respectful step backward. Helen arrived just as the first event was beginning, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing her best dress, the same one she'd worn to Ethan's high school graduation. She'd closed the salon for the day, something she'd never done except for funerals. Betty Thompson shuffled up beside her, having recruited half the town's senior citizens to serve as an impromptu cheering section. Their homemade banner read, "Thunder and Lightning," in shaky but determined letters. Grace Harrison stood apart from the crowd, positioned where she could see both the competition ring and her father's office window. Colonel Harrison hadn't appeared publicly, but she knew he was watching. He'd been drinking more heavily this week, and their conversations had devolved into shouting matches that left them both exhausted and angry. This morning, she'd found him passed out in Danny's room, clutching their son's Purple Heart medal against his chest like a shield against memories that refused to stay buried. The agility course came first, a serpentine challenge of jumps, tunnels, weave poles, and contact obstacles that tested both physical ability and mental partnership between dog and handler. Ethan watched the early competitors with growing dread. These were professional teams who'd been training together for years, their movements so synchronized they seemed to share a single mind. When their number was called, Ethan felt Thunder's body tense beneath his hand. "Just like practice, boy," he whispered, remembering Grace's advice about celebration over perfection. "Show them what a real soldier looks like." The starting whistle pierced the morning air, and Thunder exploded into motion. The months of careful rehabilitation had rebuilt not just his physical strength, but his confidence, and he attacked the course with precision that drew gasps from the crowd. Over the A-frame, without hesitation, through the tunnel like a furry missile, weaving through poles with grace that belonged in ballet rather than dog competition. When they crossed the finish line, the timer showed a result that would have been respectable for a dog half Thunder's age. The crowd's response was electric. Betty Thompson's cheering section erupted in applause, and even some of the professional handlers exchanged impressed glances. Marcus Steele's expression had shifted from contempt to grudging respect, though he still shook his head as if witnessing something that defied natural law. But it was the scent detection event that truly showcased Thunder's military background. Hidden among 40 identical white boxes was a small cache of training drugs, placed there by competition officials and undetectable to human noses. Other dogs methodically worked the field, some taking 15 minutes or more to locate the target. Thunder approached the challenge differently, his movements economical and purposeful, drawing on 4 years of explosive detection experience that had kept soldiers alive in Afghanistan. He found the target box in 93 seconds. The judges huddled in disbelief, checking their stopwatches and consulting record books. It was the fastest detection time in the competition's 15-year history. The crowd erupted again, and this time even the professional handlers joined the applause. Whatever doubts remained about Thunder's abilities were evaporating under the heat of his performance. Helen wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son accept congratulations from competitors who'd dismissed him hours earlier. "Your daddy would be so proud," she whispered to herself, touching the Purple Heart pin she'd worn on her dress for luck. The obedience trials tested the fundamental partnership between handler and dog through a series of increasingly complex exercises. Perfect heel position, extended stays while handlers moved across the ring, recalls that required dogs to stop mid-run and sit at precise distances. It was here that Thunder's military training truly shone, his responses so sharp and immediate that he seemed to anticipate Ethan's commands before they were given. But it was during the group stay exercise that Thunder's most profound transformation became visible. 7 dogs were commanded to remain in place while their handlers walked across the ring and stood with their backs turned for 3 full minutes. It was a test of trust, concentration, and emotional stability that had eliminated half the field in previous competitions. Thunder held his position like the soldier he'd always been, but his eyes never left Ethan. Not with the desperate anxiety he'd shown in early training, but with absolute faith. This was a dog who'd learned to trust again, who'd remembered that some humans were worth believing in even when the world turned dangerous and unpredictable. When the handlers were called back to their dogs, Thunder's tail began wagging before Ethan had taken 3 steps in his direction. The joy in his movement was infectious, spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. This wasn't just a competition performance, it was a celebration of healing, of the bond between species that transcended words or formal training. By late afternoon, Thunder led the competition by a margin that had the professional handlers recalculating their assumptions about what was possible. Local news crews had arrived, drawn by social media posts about the miracle dog who was rewriting the rules about age, trauma, and second chances. Reporters interviewed spectators who spoke with the kind of wonder usually reserved for religious experiences. But Ethan knew the hardest test was still ahead. The protection demonstration required Thunder to confront the very triggers that had broken him 3 years earlier. Simulated aggression, threatening movements, the kind of high-stress scenario that sent him into PTSD episodes. Everything they'd worked toward would be decided in the next hour. Grace approached as Ethan prepared Thunder for the final event, her face tight with concern. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "You've already proven everything you need to prove. Thunder's already won in every way that matters." But Ethan was thinking about something Betty Thompson had said weeks earlier, about needing a purpose, about the importance of finishing what you started. "He wants to do this," Ethan replied, watching Thunder's alert posture as they observed other teams completing their protection work. "He's been waiting 3 years to prove he's still the soldier Danny trained him to be." The protection scenario was designed to test controlled aggression and handler protection. A padded suspect would threaten the handler, and the dog was expected to bark on command, hold a protective position, and, if necessary, engage the threat under strict control. It was the most dangerous and demanding aspect of police dog work, requiring split-second decisions and absolute trust between partners. Thunder entered the ring with his head high and ears forward, but Ethan could feel the tension in the dog's body through the leash. Memories of Danny's death were written in every line of Thunder's posture, and for a moment Ethan wondered if they were pushing too hard, too fast. The suspect emerged from behind a barrier, shouting and making aggressive movements toward Ethan. Thunder's response was immediate and controlled, a deep, commanding bark that carried the authority of 4 years in combat zones. But when the suspect raised a padded sleeve as if to strike, something shifted in Thunder's eyes. For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, Thunder was back in Afghanistan, watching helplessly as an IED explosion took his partner's life. His bark faltered, his body trembled, and Ethan knew they were on the edge of a complete breakdown that would end not just their competition but potentially Thunder's recovery. But instead of giving the attack command, Ethan did something no other competitor had done. He knelt beside Thunder, placed his hand on the dog's head, and spoke the words Grace had taught him from Danny's letters. "You're a good boy, Thunder. The best partner anyone could ask for. Danny would be so proud of you." The change was instantaneous. Thunder's trembling stopped, his bark regained its confident tone, and when the suspect made another threatening move, the dog's response was picture perfect. He held his protective position with calm authority, alert but not panicked, ready but not aggressive. He was no longer a traumatized victim reliving his worst nightmare. He was a professional doing the job he'd been born to do. The crowd was on its feet before the exercise was complete, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. When the final scores were announced, Thunder had won by the largest margin in competition history. But more importantly, he'd won back something that mattered more than any trophy: his sense of himself as a protector, a partner, a dog worthy of the love Danny had given him. As Ethan accepted the winner's trophy and the job offer that came with it, he looked up at the Harrison Academy office windows and saw a figure watching from behind the blinds. Colonel Sam Harrison had witnessed every moment of his son's dog's triumph, and for the first time in 3 years, he was crying tears that had nothing to do with bourbon or regret. Thunder was going home a champion, but more than that, he was going home whole. Victory should have felt different. Thunder wore his champion's ribbon with the dignity of a war veteran accepting a medal, but the celebration lasted only as long as it took for reality to reassert itself. Within hours of leaving the competition grounds, Thunder collapsed in the back of Ethan's pickup truck, his body finally succumbing to the stress he'd been masking through sheer force of will. The drive to Grace's veterinary clinic became a nightmare of flashing hazard lights and whispered prayers. Thunder's breathing was shallow and irregular, his gums pale, his amber eyes rolled back to show too much white. Helen rode in the truck bed, cradling the dog's head in her lap while Ethan pushed his ancient vehicle harder than it had ever been asked to go. "He gave everything he had," Grace said grimly as she worked over Thunder's unconscious form on the examination table. Her hands moved with professional efficiency, starting an IV line while monitoring vital signs that painted an alarming picture. His heart rate is dangerously elevated, his core temperature is spiking, and his stress hormones are off the charts. The diagnosis was as heartbreaking as it was predictable: complete physical and emotional exhaustion complicated by cardiac stress. Thunder had pushed himself beyond his limits, driven by a need to prove his worth that went deeper than any training could address. He'd won the competition, but the victory might cost him his life. News of Thunder's collapse spread through Cedar Falls faster than wildfire. The same community that had dismissed him as worthless weeks earlier now gathered outside the veterinary clinic, leaving flowers, dog treats, and handwritten cards. Betty Thompson organized a prayer vigil that drew people from 3 counties, their candles flickering in the October darkness while Thunder fought for his life inside. But it was the unexpected visitor who arrived at midnight that changed everything. Colonel Sam Harrison appeared at the clinic's back door like a ghost materializing from his own guilt. 3 years of bourbon had carved deep lines around his eyes, and his hands shook as he removed his military cap in the presence of death that felt all too familiar. He'd watched too many good soldiers die, buried too many heroes, and now he was about to lose the last living connection to his son. "Is he going to make it?" Harrison asked Grace, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace looked up from Thunder's bedside, her own eyes red from tears and exhaustion. "I don't know, Dad. His body is shutting down. It's like he used up every reserve he had just to get through today." Harrison approached the examination table slowly, as if Thunder might disappear if he moved too quickly. The dog lay motionless under warming blankets, connected to machines that beeped steadily in the quiet clinic. For the first time in 3 years, Harrison allowed himself to really look at Thunder, not as a reminder of loss, but as a living being who'd suffered as much as anyone. "I did this to him," Harrison said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Danny left me a letter. I never opened it because I couldn't face reading his last words. But Grace found it tonight, and she made me listen while she read it aloud." He pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket pocket, the paper worn soft from 3 years of being carried but never opened. "Danny asked me to take care of Thunder. Said he wasn't just a dog, he was family. Said Thunder had PTSD just like the soldiers did, and he'd need patience and understanding to heal." The confession came pouring out like blood from a wound that had festered too long. Harrison had been so consumed by his own grief that he'd never considered Thunder might be grieving too. He'd seen the dog's withdrawal and depression as weakness rather than trauma, his refusal to work as defiance rather than heartbreak. "I blamed him for not saving Danny," Harrison continued, his voice breaking. "But the truth is, I blamed him for surviving when my son didn't. How do you forgive yourself for 3 years of cruelty to someone who was mourning the same person you were?" Ethan, who'd been maintaining his vigil beside Thunder's still form, looked up at the older man with something approaching understanding. "You start by being here now," he said quietly. "Thunder doesn't need your guilt, Colonel. He needs your help." What followed was the longest night of all their lives. Harrison, Grace, Ethan, and Helen took turns monitoring Thunder's vital signs, adjusting his IV fluids, and talking to him in the way people talk to the dying, with desperate hope and terrible honesty. They told him about Danny's love, about his heroic service, about the 23 people who were alive because of his courage and skill. But it was Harrison who provided the breakthrough. Around 4 in the morning, when Thunder's heart rate had dropped to dangerously low levels and Grace was preparing to discuss end-of-life decisions, Harrison began reading Danny's letter aloud. His voice was rough with emotion and 3 years of regret, but he pushed through every word. "Dad, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it home like we planned. I need you to know that Thunder isn't just my working dog. He's my best friend, my brother, my guardian angel. He's saved my life more times than I can count, and he's saved the lives of our entire unit. If something happens to me, please don't let his story end with mine." As Harrison's voice filled the quiet clinic, Thunder's ears twitched slightly. His breathing, which had been shallow and irregular, began to deepen. The monitor showed subtle but unmistakable improvements in heart rate and blood pressure. "He can hear you," Grace whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. Harrison continued reading, tears streaming down his face as he shared his son's words about Thunder's bravery, his intelligence, his capacity for love that went beyond anything a mere animal should possess. Danny had written about Thunder's nightmares, his fear of loud noises, his need for gentle handling by people who understood trauma. Most of all, Harrison read through his sobs, "I need you to tell him he's a good boy. Every day, Dad. Tell him he's the best boy, the bravest boy. That I'm proud of him and I love him. He needs to know he didn't fail me. He never failed anyone." At those words, Thunder's eyes fluttered open, not the blank, pain-filled stare they'd grown accustomed to, but the alert, intelligent gaze of a dog who'd been waiting 3 years to hear his partner's final message. His tail moved slightly against the blankets, the faintest wag that somehow contained all the forgiveness in the world. By dawn, Thunder was sitting up and accepting water. By noon, he was on his feet, weak but determined to rejoin the living. The crisis had passed, but something fundamental had shifted in all of them. Harrison had found his way back from the depths of grief. Thunder had received the closure he'd needed to truly heal, and a fractured family had begun the process of becoming whole again. The real victory wasn't the trophy sitting on Grace's desk. It was the moment when Sam Harrison knelt beside Thunder's recovery kennel and whispered the words his son had asked him to share 3 years too late. "You're a good boy, Thunder. The best boy. Danny would be so proud." Thunder's response was a tail wag that shook his entire body with pure joy. The weeks following Thunder's recovery brought revelations that shattered everything the Harrison family thought they knew about Danny's death. It started with a phone call from Sergeant Maria Santos, Danny's former squad mate, who'd seen the competition coverage on the national news and recognized Thunder immediately. "Colonel Harrison," her voice carried the weight of 3 years of suppressed guilt, "there are things about that day you need to know. Things we were ordered not to discuss because of the ongoing investigation." What Santos revealed during her visit to Cedar Falls contradicted the official report that had haunted Sam Harrison's nightmares. The IED that killed Danny hadn't been a random attack on their patrol route. Intelligence later confirmed it was a targeted assassination attempt against a high-value informant their unit was protecting. Danny had spotted the device during their approach and made the decision that defined his character. He'd ordered Thunder to retreat to safety while he attempted to disarm the explosive manually. "Danny didn't die because Thunder failed to protect him," Santos explained, her voice thick with emotion as she sat in Harrison's living room surrounded by his son's photographs. "Danny died because he chose to protect Thunder. He saw the IED, knew it was too sophisticated for safe disposal, and he made sure his partner was clear before he attempted to disarm it." The revelation hit Harrison like a physical blow. For 3 years he'd tortured himself and Thunder with the belief that the dog had somehow failed in his duty as protector. The truth was exactly the opposite. Danny had sacrificed himself to save his 4-legged partner, demonstrating the same protective instinct that Thunder had shown throughout their deployment. But Santos wasn't finished. From her military duffel bag, she retrieved a metal ammunition box that had been sealed for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to deliver its contents. Inside were dozens of letters Danny had written to his father and never sent, along with photographs, medals, and a video recording made just days before his death. "Danny knew the mission was dangerous," Santos continued. "He recorded this message for you and asked me to deliver it if anything happened to him. I couldn't face coming here before now, but seeing Thunder on the news, seeing him happy again, Danny would have wanted you to have this." The video showed Danny in his combat gear, Thunder sleeping peacefully beside him in their shared tent. Even through the small screen, the bond between soldier and dog was unmistakable. Danny's words were meant for his father, but they painted a picture of Thunder that contradicted everything Harrison had believed. "Dad, if you're watching this, then Thunder and I didn't make it home together like we planned. I need you to understand something about my partner here. He's not just the best military working dog I've ever seen. He's the most loyal friend anyone could ask for. He's saved our entire squad more times than I can count, and he's probably saved my life at least a dozen times." Danny paused in the recording to scratch Thunder's ears, causing the sleeping dog to wag his tail without opening his eyes. Thunder has nightmares sometimes, just like we do. He wakes up whimpering, and I have to hold him until he remembers he's safe. The war affects him just like it affects us, but he never lets his fear stop him from doing his job. The most devastating revelation came near the end of the recording, when Danny looked directly into the camera with the intensity that had made him a natural leader. "If something happens to me, Dad, please don't blame Thunder. He would die before he let anything hurt me, and I know he'd blame himself if he couldn't protect me. But sometimes, even heroes can't prevent tragedy. Sometimes love means accepting that some battles can't be won." Harrison watched the video 3 times before he could speak, each viewing revealing new layers of his son's wisdom and the depth of his relationship with Thunder. Danny had understood his father's tendency toward guilt and self-blame, and he'd tried to protect both Thunder and Harrison from the burden of survivor's remorse. Grace found her father in Danny's room the next morning, not drunk for the first time in months, but sober and clear-eyed as he carefully sorted through his son's belongings. The shrine-like preservation of the room had been another form of torture, keeping Danny frozen in death rather than celebrating his life. Now Harrison was finally ready to honor his son's memory properly. "I want to establish a foundation," Harrison told Grace as they worked together to pack Danny's military uniforms for donation to the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. "Something that helps military working dogs transition to civilian life, especially dogs dealing with combat trauma." The Danny Harrison Foundation for Military Working Dogs became more than just a charitable organization. It became a bridge between the military and civilian communities, addressing a need that most people never realized existed. Thousands of military dogs retired each year, many carrying psychological scars from their service that made them difficult to place in traditional homes. Ethan's role in the foundation drew on everything he'd learned during Thunder's rehabilitation, but it also revealed talents he'd never known he possessed. His natural empathy with traumatized animals, combined with the training techniques Grace had taught him, made him uniquely qualified to help other handlers understand the complex needs of combat veterans, both human and canine. Helen's involvement brought a different perspective to the Foundation's work. Her background as a widow who'd raised a military child gave her insights into the family dynamics that complicated veteran reintegration. She organized support groups for military families adopting retired working dogs, helping them understand that healing was a process that couldn't be rushed or forced. Thunder's role in the Foundation was perhaps the most important of all. As the organization's unofficial mascot and success story, he accompanied Ethan to veterans' hospitals, military bases, and rehabilitation centers across the region. His presence seemed to communicate something that words couldn't capture, that healing was possible, that trauma didn't have to define the rest of your life, that even the most broken spirits could find their way back to joy. The Foundation's first major success came 6 months after its establishment, when they successfully placed 12 retired military working dogs with veteran families. Each placement required months of careful matching, training, and support, but the results were transformational for both dogs and humans. Veterans dealing with PTSD found purpose in caring for animals who understood their struggles, while dogs who'd been deemed unadoptable thrived in homes where their service was honored rather than feared. But it was the unexpected reunion that provided the Foundation's most powerful moment. Master Sergeant James Rodriguez had been Thunder's handler before Danny during the dog's first deployment to Iraq. Rodriguez had been wounded during a patrol and medically retired, leaving Thunder to be reassigned to Danny's unit. For 5 years, Rodriguez had wondered what happened to his former partner, carrying guilt about abandoning the dog he'd loved like a son. When Rodriguez arrived at the Foundation's Cedar Falls facility, Thunder's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The dog launched himself across the training yard, his dignity forgotten in the pure joy of recognizing someone he'd thought was lost forever. Rodriguez collapsed to his knees, sobbing as Thunder covered his face with kisses, both of them seeming to understand that some bonds transcend time and circumstances. "I thought you'd forgotten me," Rodriguez whispered into Thunder's fur, his voice breaking with 3 years of suppressed grief. Thunder's response was to settle beside Rodriguez and place his head in the veteran's lap, a gesture of comfort that spoke to the depth of their connection. Here was proof that military working dogs didn't just serve, they loved, remembered, and carried their own emotional burdens from the battlefield. The reunion sparked national media attention for the foundation, but more importantly, it demonstrated the complex emotional lives of military working dogs and the lasting impact of the bonds they formed during service. Thunder had moved beyond his trauma to become a healer, but he'd never forgotten the humans who'd shaped his life before Danny. As Harrison watched Thunder comfort Rodriguez, he finally understood what his son had tried to tell him in that final video. Thunder wasn't just a dog who'd failed to save Danny. He was a living testament to the love, loyalty, and sacrifice that defined the best of military service. He'd carried the weight of Danny's loss just as Harrison had, but unlike Harrison, he'd found a way to transform that grief into something that helped others heal. The truth had set them all free, but it had also revealed the deeper truth that healing was never a destination. It was a journey they'd continue taking together, one day at a time. 5 years after Thunder's miraculous competition victory, Cedar Falls had transformed into something nobody could have imagined. The Danny Harrison Foundation for Military Working Dogs had grown from a local charity into a national organization with facilities in 12 states. But it was the changes in the people that mattered most. The foundation's headquarters occupied the renovated Harrison Academy, where the sterile training rings had been replaced with comfortable therapy spaces designed to help both dogs and veterans heal together. Thunder, now 13 years old with a silver-touched muzzle and slower gait, had become something of a legend in the military working dog community. His story was taught at canine training schools as an example of resilience and second chances. But those who knew him best understood that his greatest achievement wasn't the competition he'd won, it was the healing he'd inspired in others. The morning of the Foundation's 5th anniversary celebration found Thunder in his favorite spot, a sunny patch of grass beside the memorial garden where Danny's headstone was surrounded by flowers from grateful military families. Ethan, now 27 and the Foundation's head trainer, sat beside his old partner, gray, streaking his own hair from the weight of responsibilities that had aged him beyond his years. "You know what today is, don't you, boy?" Ethan said, scratching behind Thunder's ears with the same gentle touch that had first earned the dog's trust. 5 years since you taught an entire town about second chances." Thunder's tail thumped against the ground, though his movements were careful now, arthritis having claimed some of the fluid grace that had once made him a champion. But his amber eyes still held intelligence and warmth, and his presence still had the power to calm the most traumatized veterans who came to the Foundation seeking help. Helen emerged from the main building carrying a tray of sandwiches for the volunteer coordinators who were setting up for the afternoon ceremony. At 57, she'd found her calling as the Foundation's family support director, helping military spouses and children understand the unique challenges of integrating retired working dogs into their homes. Her hair salon had closed 3 years earlier, but she'd never been happier or more fulfilled. "Ethan, honey, you need to eat something," she called, using the tone that had guided him through childhood. "Grace is looking for you, and Colonel Harrison wants to go over the ceremony schedule one more time." Sam Harrison, now 63 and sober for over 4 years, had undergone the most dramatic transformation of anyone. The bitter, broken man who'd used a war hero as a tool for cruelty had evolved into a passionate advocate for military working dog welfare. His testimony before Congress had helped pass legislation providing better care for retired K-9 veterans, and his speaking engagements at military bases across the country carried the authority of someone who'd experienced the deepest consequences of untreated trauma. Grace appeared in the garden's entrance, her veterinary coat replaced by the flowing dress she'd chosen for her wedding to Ethan, scheduled for next month. At 31, she'd completed her doctorate in animal psychology and had become one of the nation's leading experts on combat trauma in military working dogs. But today, she carried news that would change everything once again. "Ethan, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice carrying an excitement she was trying to contain. "Thunder, too, actually. He needs to hear this." Ethan looked up from where he'd been lost in memories, noting the flush in Grace's cheeks and the envelope clutched in her hands. "What is it?" "A letter from the Pentagon," Grace said, settling beside them on the grass where Thunder could see her face as she spoke. "Thunder has been selected to receive the Animals in War and Peace Medal of Bravery. It's the highest honor a military working dog can receive." The recognition had been years in the making, as military bureaucracy slowly acknowledged the heroism that had been hidden by classified mission reports. Thunder's service record, once buried in confidential files, had finally been declassified to reveal the full extent of his contributions to military operations. 23 lives saved, 17 explosive devices detected, 4 years of flawless service in one of the world's most dangerous combat zones. Achievements that would have made him famous if they hadn't been protected by national security classifications. "The ceremony will be at Arlington National Cemetery," Grace continued, reading from the official letter. "Thunder will be the oldest living recipient of the award, and they want him there for the presentation." Thunder's ears perked up at the mention of his name, though Ethan wondered if the old dog could handle the stress of travel and ceremony at his age. But as if reading his handler's mind, Thunder struggled to his feet with determined dignity, his posture straightening into something approaching his former military bearing. The soldier in him had never truly retired. The weeks leading up to the Arlington ceremony brought a parade of visitors to Cedar Falls, all wanting to meet the legendary dog whose story had inspired a national conversation about the treatment of military working dog veterans. Documentary filmmakers, journalists, and retired service members made pilgrimages to the foundation, each seeking to understand how a broken dog had become a symbol of healing and redemption. But it was the visit from Thunder's former squad mates that provided the most emotional preparation for his final moment of recognition. 7 veterans who'd served alongside Thunder and Danny in Afghanistan made the journey to Wyoming, carrying photos, medals, and stories that painted a picture of heroism that went far beyond official citations. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, now retired and working as a PTSD counselor in Atlanta, shared the story of Thunder's first life-saving detection. "We were 3 days into a patrol when Thunder suddenly went rigid, that full-body alert that meant stop everything right now. Danny trusted him completely, called in the explosive ordnance team, and they found an IED buried right in our planned route. If Thunder hadn't detected it, our entire convoy would have driven right over it." Each veteran carried similar stories, building a portrait of Thunder as not just a working dog, but as a guardian angel who'd kept entire units alive through instinct, training, and an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. Their presence seemed to energize Thunder, as if their familiar voices awakened memories of purpose and brotherhood that transcended species. The journey to Arlington National Cemetery became a caravan of healing, with Thunder traveling in a custom RV donated by a grateful military contractor, surrounded by the Harrison family, his squad mates, and dozens of veterans whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. Along the route, Crowds gathered at truck stops and rest areas, drawn by social media posts tracking Thunder's progress toward his moment of national recognition. The ceremony itself took place on a crisp October morning that echoed the day Thunder had won his competition 5 years earlier. But instead of 300 spectators in a small Wyoming town, Thunder faced an audience of thousands at America's most sacred military cemetery. Generals, politicians, and media representatives filled the viewing stands, but Thunder's attention was focused on the small group of people who'd made his healing possible. When Secretary of Defense Patricia Martinez approached with the medal, Thunder stood at attention with the same precision he'd displayed during his military service. His arthritis was forgotten, his age irrelevant. He was once again the soldier Danny had trained him to be. The citation read aloud to the assembled crowd detailed heroism that most civilians couldn't imagine, but Thunder's squad mates nodded with recognition at each exploit mentioned. "This medal recognizes not just Thunder's service to our nation," Secretary Martinez said as she attached the ribbon to Thunder's ceremonial collar, "but his continued service as a symbol of healing and second chances for all our military working dog veterans." The ceremony's most powerful moment came when Thunder was led to the tomb of the unknown soldier for a final honor guard salute. As the ceremonial rifles fired their tribute, Thunder didn't flinch or cower as he might have in the early days of his PTSD recovery. Instead, he stood proudly beside Ethan, accepting the honor not just for himself, but for all the military working dogs whose sacrifices had gone unrecognized. That evening, as Thunder rested in his hotel room surrounded by flowers and cards from well-wishers across the nation, Grace noticed his breathing had become labored. The excitement and travel had taken their toll on his aging heart, but there was peace in his amber eyes that hadn't been there since Danny's death. He'd received his final recognition, completed his last mission, and could finally rest with the knowledge that his service had been honored and his story would inspire others long after he was gone. 3 days after returning to Cedar Falls, Thunder died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by everyone who'd loved him back to wholeness. His legacy lived on in the foundation that bore his spirit, the veterans he'd helped heal, and the proof that sometimes the most broken among us carry the greatest capacity for redemption. Thunder's story reminds us that life's greatest victories often come disguised as our most painful defeats. How many of us have faced moments when we felt discarded, overlooked, or written off by others? Like Thunder, many American seniors know the sting of being considered past our prime, whether through forced retirement, health challenges, or society's dismissive attitude toward aging. Yet, Thunder's transformation from a broken, forgotten war hero to a symbol of healing proves that our most meaningful chapters can begin when others assume our story has ended. His journey with young Ethan shows us that wisdom and experience, when paired with fresh hope and determination, create an unstoppable force for good. Sam Harrison's redemption reminds us that it's never too late to heal old wounds, seek forgiveness, and rebuild relationships we thought were beyond repair. The Foundation. Thunder Inspired continues helping veterans and military dogs find new purpose, proving that our struggles can become the very platform from which we lift others. Sometimes God uses our deepest pain to prepare us for our greatest purpose, not despite our scars, but because of them. What impossible dream are you still carrying in your heart? Have you ever witnessed someone's second act that inspired your own belief in new beginnings? Share your thoughts below.